Welcome to episode 97 on the Law Report. In today's episode, we're going to discuss the very recent amendments to the Firearm Ordinance. But before I do, my usual disclaimer, this is not legal advice, should not be construed as such. For legal advice, please contact an attorney of your choice. Welcome back. So, subsections 2, 3, and 4 of section 30 of the principal ordinance is amended and substituted. This amendment was published in the Gazette today, the 18th of June, 2024, and it is set to come into effect tomorrow, the 19th of June, 2024. But before I look at this section, it begs the question, did the US government, the United States, pressure or force the government of the Turks and Caicos Islands to amend the Firearm Ordinance in wake of several US citizens who were arrested and charged for possession of ammunition and even firearm in the Turks and Caicos Islands? We know that the delegation of US lawmakers came down, had meeting with the Premier, the Governor, and actually wanted to also meet with the Chief Justice. Luckily, that did not happen, so the integrity of the judiciary remains intact as far as I am aware. But let's look at the legislation before the amendments come into place. Let's look at section 30 and let's look at subsection 2. It states that the court shall impose a term of imprisonment of at least the required mandatory minimum term unless the person was under the age of 18 years at the time of the commission of the offense, unless, in the opinion of the court, there are exceptional circumstances relating to the offense and the person convicted, which would justify the court in departing from the mandatory minimum sentence. Subsection 3, the court, in considering for the purposes of subsection 2, whether a sentence of less than the mandatory minimum term is just in all the circumstances, may have regard in particular to A, whether the person convicted of the offense has a previous conviction for an offense under this ordinance, B, whether the public interest in preventing the unlawful possession or use, manufacture, transfer, sale, or acquisition of firearms would be served by the imposition of a lesser sentence. Under subsection 4, the following shall not constitute exceptional circumstances for the purposes of section 2, justifying the imposition of a lesser sentence. A, whether the person pleaded guilty to the offense or whether the person materially assisted in the investigation of the offense. So, as we can see, as it stood before the repeal comes into effect, the judge, as it would appear, was directed by Section 30 to impose the minimum mandatory sentence unless exceptional circumstances were found. Now, everyone remember that earlier this year there was an AG reference that went to the Court of Appeal where the Attorney General sought a declaration from the court that certain sentences handed down by the court in firearm offences were unduly lenient, or that the court was wrong in finding exceptional circumstances. And the court held inter alia that even under findings of exceptional circumstances, the sentencing court had no powers to impose a non-custodial sentence. In other words, the sentencing court was not at large to impose a sentence that it felt fit the circumstances of the case, that it was duty bound in law to pass a custodial sentence. Now it would appear that the amendment addressed that issue, but since the amendment came so quick on the heels of the outcry from the United States and the United States politicians, it may be fair to infer that the Turks and Caicos Islands bow to pressure. Well, let's look at that for one moment before we look at the amendments. According to an online report from Newsline TCI.com that reported on the amendment, the article states that the Attorney General, the Honorable Randall Brathwaite Knowles, OBE, Casey, who piloted the bill through the House, informed members that the bill was the result of a considered review of regional legislation, especially other overseas territories, as well as consultation with the judiciary, the Bar Council, the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions, and Senior Criminal Defense Counsel, who all agree that the clarification should be made. She further indicated that the amendment would address marginal cases of exceptional circumstances for both residents and visitors alike, where the court was best placed to determine the appropriate penalty. So, were these amendments to the firearm legislation the result of pressure from the United States of America because of fear of being blacklisted or sanctioned, or were these amendments in the works for some time? You decide. So let's look at the amendments. Section 30, Section 3 states, the principal ordinance is amended in Section 30 by repealing subsections 2, 3, and 4 and substituting the following. The code may impose a term of imprisonment of less than the mandatory minimum term or a fine are both if the person was under the age of 18 years, if the court is of the opinion that there are exceptional circumstances. So the only change that I can disown is that the court is now empowered to impose a sentence less than the minimum mandatory term or a fine or both. So a person could be fined, the person could be imprisoned and fined. So now the judge has a discretion whether to impose a fine as a standalone punishment or whether to impose both a fine and imprisonment. So one may argue that the judge has, the sentencing judge that is, has more discretion, and this may be the clarity in the law that the Attorney General has alluded to. Subsection 3 of the amendment states that the court, in considering for the purposes of subsection 2, whether imposing a sentence of less than the mandatory minimum sentence or a fine or both is just in all the circumstances, may have regard in particular to whether the person convicted of the offense has previous conviction under this ordinance, or whether there is a public interest in preventing the unlawful possession, use, manufacture, transfer, or acquisition of firearm. So the only dishonorable change that I can glean again is where a fine or both is added to the mandatory minimum term, giving the judge a discretion either to sentence to a prison sentence or to a fine and a prison sentence. So it provides the judge with some leeway in imposing a sentence, whether to impose a term of imprisonment and a fine, or just a fine with no term of imprisonment. And subsection 4 states the following shall not constitute exceptional circumstances for the purposes of subsection 2 to justify the imposition of a sentence of less than the mandatory minimum term or a fine or both. Again, the amendment introduced an option where the judge at sentence can either sentence the term of imprisonment by itself, could charge a fine with no term of imprisonment, or could sentence the convicted person to a term of imprisonment and a fine. Those are the only significant changes to the ordinance. Let's see going forward if this is only to benefit tourists who come to the Turks and Caicos Islands and flaunt the laws of the Turks and Caicos Islands, or if locals being arrested and charged for offences under this ordinance, if they are going to benefit from the amendments. Before I finish this episode, let me say that when this ordinance was amended previously to include or to up the minimum mandatory sentence from a term of imprisonment of 7 years to 12 years, very few persons in the Turks and Caicos Islands spoke up and said that this was madness, that it was unworkable. Nobody actually listened until Americans were caught under the ordinance. Then everyone went into panic, and now we have an amendment. The people, in my view, who deserve to be sentenced to the mandatory sentence are the people who, without thought and proper consultations and without looking at all scenarios, rush to pass this legislation in the first place. And for that, they should be sentenced to the most severe sentence of all, life in front of a mirror. Here is where I will leave this episode for today. If you like anything that I said, please give it a thumbs up. And if you disagree, give it a thumbs down. But I'll see you very shortly in my next episode. Cheers.